All right, welcome back, people of the internet. I'm Seth Monahan, professor of music theory, and this is video number 19 in my series on classical harmony and counterpoint. Today, we're going to learn how to use inverted dominant chords. And our main focus is going to be the three inversions of 5/7. In other words, 5/6/5, 5/4/3, and 5/4/2. And I want to start by saying these three chords are just as common and really just as important as the root position 5/7 that we learned about in video 15. But I also have some good news. The voice leading with these is much simpler than root position 5/7. Think back to video 15. Do you remember how root position 5/7 had three different resolution options depending on whether or how you used complete or incomplete chords? Well, there's none of that here. Now we use one set of resolution rules and it applies to all three inversions. Super simple. So let's start by just taking stock of what notes are in a 5/7 chord. We're going to have scale degree 5 as the root, scale degree 7 as the chordal third, scale degree 2 as the chordal fifth, and scale degree 4 as the chordal seventh. And if we're dealing with inverted 5/7s, we're talking about any instance of the chord that has one of these three notes in the bass, right? Any note but the root, and we've got an inversion. Now, in video 15, I explained that two of the notes in a root position 5/7 are called tendency tones, notes that want to resolve in a certain direction by step. And that applies here too. So once again, scale degree 7 is a tendency tone. It's the leading tone, and it wants to resolve up to tonic, wherever it occurs, in the top voice, in an inner voice, or in the bass. And once again, the chordal seventh is also a tendency tone. This one wants to resolve down by step into scale degree 3. And together, these two tendency tones create a tritone, which will always resolve into some consonant third or consonant sixth. But these aren't the only predictable notes in the chord. Scale degree 5, which is no longer in the bass now because the chords are inverted, scale degree 5 is probably going to stay right where it is because it's a common tone shared by both chords. And that just leaves scale degree 2, which is a bit freer. It can go by step either down to 1 or up to scale degree 3. Usually down, but up 2, that's totally fine. So these guidelines let us resolve any inverted 5/7. Let's try it out using a first inversion 5/7, which is obviously 5/6/5. Now 5/6/5 is going to have the chordal third, scale degree 7, in the bass. And as for voicing the rest of it, let's put the root in the middle of the top staff, the chordal fifth above that, and the chordal seventh below it. Now to resolve this, we just follow the arrows in the chart. So starting with the bass, the red chordal third wants to move up by step to tonic. And because of this, we now know that 5/6/5, which always has the leading tone in the bass, will always resolve to a root position tonic, never to an inverted one. So moving to the upper voices, we've got our yellow chordal seventh, which wants to resolve down by step to scale degree 3. The chordal root, which stays right where it is, and the chordal fifth, which can go up or down by step. Here, let's take it down by step. So there you go. We just resolved this chord by simply letting the chart do our thinking for us. Now, if you're wondering what would be different if we were in C minor rather than C major, the answer is almost nothing is different. The voices move exactly the same way. The only difference is that you have to remember to raise scale degree 7 so that your dominant has a proper leading tone. So here's the sound of this in C minor. Let's try a 5/4/2 now. This is just as easy. Now our yellow chordal seventh is in the bass. That's going to want to resolve down by step. And because of this, we now know that any instance of 5/4/2 will always resolve to a first inversion tonic because it has to lead into a tonic that has the chordal third in the bass. Okay? And then moving up, we've got our chordal root, which stays where it is, our leading tone, which goes up, and scale degree 2, which for the sake of variety, maybe we can have that go up here as well. So here's the whole thing. Or in minor. Now let's try 5-4-3. That puts the blue chordal fifth in the bass. Because that note can go up or down, we've got two resolution options. If it goes up to a scale degree 3, we arrive on a 1/6, just like we see here. Or, if it goes down by step, it'll take us to a 1 chord instead. And those are both totally common. So let's summarize what we just learned. On the one hand, we've got the inversions of 5-7 that have tendency tones in the bass, so we only have one resolution option. There's 5-6-5, which has scale degree 7 in the bass, and that resolves to tonic. There's 5-4-2, which has scale degree 4 in the bass, which always resolves to 1/6. And then there's 5-4-3, whose bass is not a tendency tone, scale degree 2, and that gives us two options. It can go down, giving us a root position tonic, or up into a 1/6. Another way to visualize this is as motions on a musical staff. So let's imagine we're in C major. Here are the bass notes to 1 and 1/6. And we can see on the staff that these two notes are surrounded on every side by the bass notes of inverted 5-7s. So below tonic is the leading tone, the bass of 5-6-5. Above 1/6 lies the bass note of 5-4-2. And then between them is scale degree 2, it's the bass of 5-4-3, and it can go either way. So now we know how to resolve inverted 5-7s to tonic. But I have to stress here, these rules only apply when these chords resolve to tonic. If you want to take an inverted 5-7 to tonic, then the voice leading is strict. You have to follow the chart. But inverted 5-7s don't always go to tonic. If we wanted to move on to, say, some other version of 5-7, inverted or not, then there are literally no rules. The voices can leap however they like, and the tendency tones can be passed around from one voice to another with no issue. It's only when they resolve to tonic that we have to fuss over where the tendency tones want to go. And you should also know that the voice leading is equally free moving into inverted 5-7s, whether you're moving in from some tonic or some other dominant. And as we'll see later, the motion from predominance into inverted 5-7s is pretty free as well, although it does tend to be smooth rather than leapy. So now that we know how to voice lead the three inversions of 5-7, we should take a quick look at dominant triads. As I explained in video 17, there are two triads that normally have a dominant function, 5 and 7 diminished. And these tend to behave like the inverted 5-7s that have the same bass note. In a way, we can even think of these triads as kind of incomplete inverted 5-7s. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start on the left with 5-4-3. If we leave out the chordal root of 5-4-3, we get 7 diminished 6. Now that's a really common chord, that's why it's in the big 18, and it's one that behaves exactly, and I mean exactly like 5-4-3. Like they are basically interchangeable. Here's 5-4-3, here's 7 diminished. Very similar sounding chords. Or, by contrast, we could leave out the chordal 7th of 5-4-3, and in that case we'd get a 5-6-4, a dominant triad and second inversion. This is rather less common, but when we see it, it does tend to behave just like a 5-4-3. It's just a little less dissonant. So let's go over to 5-6-5 now. If we were to leave out the chordal 7th of 5-6-5, we get 5-6, which is another very common big 18 chord. And it's a chord that behaves just like 5-6-5. It's got the leading tone in the bass, so when it goes to tonic, it'll go to a root position tonic. Now, by contrast, if we leave out the root of 5-6-5, we get a diminished triad. We get 7 diminished. And when we see this, it tends to behave just like 5-6-5 and 5-6. The thing is, we almost never see it. It usually only turns up in textures that only have 3 active voices, like in string or wind trios, so composers don't tend to use this one unless they really have to. So now it's time to step back and make some broader observations about the ways that inverted 5-7s behave in real music. And we're going to look first at situations where the bass moves by step. More specifically, we're going to look at stepwise motions and what I call the bottom tier of the scale. Now, what does that mean? Well, I've always found it useful to divide the scale into two parts. An upper tier, which connects scale degree 5 up to scale degree 1, and a bottom tier, which is the lower 5 notes of the scale with the leading tone tacked onto the bottom. And the reason I make this distinction is that composers tend to do different things when their bass is moving through these different parts of the scale. And one of the most common uses of inverted 5/7s is to allow stepwise bass lines throughout the bottom tier. And this includes both constrained zigzagging motions and long stepwise lines. So let's start by looking at a few typical zigzagging motions. Here's a theme from Beethoven's C minor piano trio. And when we listen to it, and I don't mean just this one, with all the examples ahead, when we listen, I want you to really focus on the bass line. I mean, like, sing along with the bass line as you listen on scale degrees if you can, because it's really going to connect you to what's happening in the bass line much more firmly. So as you're listening and hopefully singing along, listen for the point where the bass line moves back and forth by step in the lower tier. So what do we hear? The bass starts with a pattern that suggests a complete functional cycle. 1-4-5-1. Or tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic. So then we get our zigzagging with a bunch of back and forth motions around the tonic, scale degrees 1, 2, 1, 7, 1. And predictably, they support root position tonic, 5-4-3, resolves back to tonic, 5-6-5, resolves up to tonic. And it ends with a dominant triad, a half cadence. So when we listen again, I want you to notice the very different qualities of the dominant chords in the last two bars of the passage. Specifically, I want you to notice how the two inverted 5/7s seem to wind around the tonic chord, embellishing it without really replacing it, but then the last dominant, the triad, really feels like an important harmonic arrival. It's much more secure, much more stable. And for just one more example of a zigzagging bass line, let's listen to the second theme from Schubert's C minor piano sonata, one of his last works. Here we're going to focus on just bars 1 and 2. And again, notice how the inverted 5/7s create a bass line that winds around the tonic chord, embellishing it before the big move to 4 in bar 3. We start on scale degree 1. There are 2 motions away and back again to 5-4-3, and then we dip down to 5-6-5 and back to tonic. Have a listen. And as a contrast to these two examples, check out this theme from Beethoven's Opus 109 Piano Sonata. Here, instead of zigzagging, the bass unfolds a very slow, painstaking climb from tonic up to scale degree 4 and then back again, alternating tonic and dominant every bar. He starts on 1, up to 5-4-3, 1-6, 5-4-2, and then changes direction. 1-6, 5-4-3, 5-6-5, and finally 1. And notice that this progression takes us through all 3 inversions of 5/7. We've got 5-4-3 connecting 1 and 1-6. We've got 5-4-2 sitting just above 1-6, and then we approach our final tonic through 5-6-5 from below. Also notice here how Beethoven leaps out of 5-4-3 into the bass of 5-6-5. As I mentioned before, this is not only possible, it's actually very easy because your tendency tones don't have to do anything special. We only fuss over the tendency tones when we resolve into tonic. Let's listen to the whole passage, and as we do, really tune yourself into the energetics of that bass line, how the tonics feel like the more stable points, and the dominants seem to have this urge to keep moving back into a stable platform of the tonic. This passage also shows us something important about stepwise bass motions in the bottom tier. Now notice that Beethoven ascends all the way from scale degree 1 to scale degree 4 in the bass, but then changes direction. That's because he has to. A minute ago, I said that inverted 5/7s let you move your bass line by step all throughout the bottom tier. But there's one stepwise motion you can't do using just tonic and dominant. Here's a diagram I used a few minutes ago to show how inverted 5/7s can resolve into 1 and 1/6. If we're talking about how bass lines move in general, these should be double-headed arrows, of course, because we can step freely from tonics into dominants just like we can move by step from dominants into tonics. But let's not forget that the bottom tier goes all the way up to scale degree 5, and scale degree 5 supports 2 additional dominant chords, root position 5 or 1/6/4. And here's the thing, bass lines are free to step down from 5 to 4, but they can't do the opposite. If you're using just tonics and dominants, then scale degree 4 is going to be the bass of a 5/4/2 chord, and that has to resolve down by step. So if you want to have a bass line that rises all the way up from 1 to scale degree 5, you have to use a predominant over scale degree 4. We can see this really clearly in the slow movement of Mendelssohn's first piano trio. Like Beethoven, he starts on tonic, he climbs up the scale through 5/4/3 to 1/6, and then on scale degree 4, he uses a predominant, and that lets him rise all the way to scale degree 5, where he then changes direction, and now because he's going down, he uses scale degree 4 below a 5/4/2 chord, because that 4 will resolve down to 3, giving us a 1/6, and then there's a standard cadence formula, 2, 5, 1. Have a listen. And this kind of rising bass line is extremely common in the classical style. We've actually seen a bunch of them already. You might remember the opening of Beethoven's first piano sonata, which I've used in a few videos now, and that starts by dipping from tonic down to 5/6/5 and back. And then he marches up the scale all the way to the cadential 5 through 7/6, 1/6, 2/6/5, and finally the dominant. But as you probably know, bass lines don't always just inch along by step. Leaps are extremely common. And again, the main restriction is that when an inverted 5/7 resolves to tonic, the bass can't leap. It has to move by step. We can see this really clearly in the slow movement from Mozart's K464 string quartet in A major. His bass line starts on tonic, steps up to 5/4/3, and then from there leaps down into the bass of a 5/4/2 chord. And since now he's going to go to tonic, the voices will all resolve smoothly by step. And then from here, the bass leaps again up into the leading tone, where he uses a dominant triad, a 5/6 instead of a 5/6/5. And because we're going to tonic, everybody moves efficiently through a couple of non-chord tones into the notes of the tonic triad. Here's how it sounds. Here's another example. This one's from the slow movement of Beethoven's Ninth, and we're just going to focus on the first 2.5 bars. The downbeats here are all tonics. We've got 2 root position tonic chords and a 1/6 in the middle. But between these fall inverted 5/7s whose bass notes are approached by leap. Beethoven sets up the 1/6 by leaping into the 5/4/2, and then he sets up the last tonic by leaping into the bass of 5/6/5. Check it out. And here's just one more example of a leaping bass. This one's from Mozart's D minor piano fantasy. Now, these 4 bars are just the first half of a slow-moving 8-bar sentence, but they feature a really common bass pattern, where you have 2 root position tonic chords connected by 2 inverted 5/7s. So we start by stepping up into the bass of 5/4/3, and then the bass leaps down into the leading tone, supporting 5/6/5, which then resolves by step into the root position tonic again. Have a listen. So there's 2 more quick things. The first has to do with predominance. All of the inverted 5/7s we've seen so far have been approached either by tonic or from some other 5/7. But of course, you can approach inverted 5/7s through a predominant. And when this happens, the voice leading tends to be pretty smooth, usually most voices moving by step. Composers don't tend to leap wildly from a predominant into any dominant, really. So here's another example we've seen a few times in this series. This is the chorale Ich bin's, ich sollte büßen from Bach's St. Matthew Passion. And as you may recall, it contains 2 overlapping functional cycles anchored by 3 root position tonic chords. The second and third tonics are both approached by step from some inverted dominant. The first is approached from above by 7/6, and the second one is approached from below in the bass by 5/6/5. But each of those dominants is prepared by a predominant. In the first bar, Bach uses a passing tone C to connect the bass of 4 with 7/6, and then in the last bar, he approaches the leading tone from below with this wonderfully pungent 4/6/5 chord. That's not a big 18 predominant, but it's a fantastic chord. So have a listen. Here's another example. This is from Haydn's Opus 20 string quartets. This passage is anchored by 4 tonics, 3 of them in root position, 1 in first inversion. And Haydn approaches each of these using an inverted 5/7 with a tendency tone in the bass. We've got 2 instances of 5/6/5 leading into root position tonic, and 1 instance of 5/4/2 moving into 1/6. But Haydn sets up that 5/4/2 with a predominant that actually shares the same bass note. Bar 3 starts with a 4 chord, and then all the upper voices move up by step, giving us a 5/4/2. This is a really wonderful moment because as the voices slide upwards, they make that consonant bass note into a tendency tone that wants to drop downward. And at the same time, the melody is reaching up through the leading tone to the highest note of the phrase. So you've got the tendency tones in the outer voices. And it's wonderful that that's echoed with the tendency tones swapped. So that the very last motion is 7 going to 1 in the bass, with 4 going to 3 in the melody. So this is echoed by this. Here's how it sounds. Okay, one last thing. My hope here was to make clear that the voice leading of inverted 5/7s was easy and pretty predictable. But there are 2 really common exceptions we want to touch on. The first has to do with 5/4/2. In 5/4/2, the top voice often leaps rather than moves by step, usually from scale degree 2 to scale degree 5, while the other voices do their thing and move smoothly. Here's a really famous instance from the slow movement of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. This one's a lot like that slow movement from the Ninth Symphony we heard, where you've got a tonic chord on each of the first 3 downbeats, and each of them is prepared by a dominant chord approached by a leap in the bass. So you've got tonic, moves into 5-4-2, into 1-6, and then we leap again, 5-6-5, into 1. But look closely at the voice leading of 5-4-2, and for this I'm going to use the color coding I used at the beginning of the video. Here we can see that the blue chordal 5th, scale degree 2, doesn't actually move by step, but resolves up by leap into scale degree 5. Now this isn't really mind-blowing, I guess, because scale degree 2 is not a tendency tone, but this is a really common pattern, so I want to put it on your radar. Let's have a listen to the passage. Our second and final voice leading exception has to do with 5-4-3. When 5-4-3 goes to 1-6, the chordal 7th sometimes rises rather than falls. This typically happens when it's in the top voice, moving in parallel tenths with the bass. So here's the opening of the scherzo from Beethoven's 3rd, Opus 31 Piano Sonata. The harmony moves really quickly here, so let's track what happens in the bass line. We start on tonic, we rise through 5-4-3 to 1-6, continue upward to a predominant, then move down in thirds, another predominant, 5-6, and then tonic, which arpeggiates up to the dominant at the half cadence. So I'm going to play a recording that includes these 4 bars and the next 4, which are a consequent phrase that are basically the same thing except the cadence is different. So you're going to actually hear the progression twice. So let's zoom in on those first 2 bars. And here I'm going to use the color coding again that really helps us see how that yellow chordal 7th rises by step instead of falling. So we have... The reason that Beethoven's able to get away with this, the reason why he's able to break this rule, is it actually has to do with the outer voice counterpoint. If we simplify the counterpoint here, we can see really clearly a set of rising tenths. And the linear logic, the sweep of those rising tenths just overrides the need of that chordal 7th to resolve down. It's not super common, but it does happen. So that's all you need to know, and honestly, probably a lot more than you needed to know about inverted dominance. The next video is going to be a bit shorter, I think, and it's going to look at situations where the 4 chord doesn't function as a predominant. So I hope to see you then.